This wasn't a biker war. This was open season. One day people were riding, the next they were being hunted. Sudden attacks, parked bikes, and bodies left behind. This was years of ambushes, surprise executions, and bodies dropping in places no one expected. Two of the most feared biker clubs in North America went head-to-head, and once it started, there was no off switch. No peace talks, no clean endings, just retaliation stacked on top of retaliation. Two clubs locked into a war so heinous that the violence became a routine. This is the story of the Hells Angels versus the Sons of Silence, the most brutal biker war in history. Two clubs on the same road. To understand how the conflict between the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club and the Sons of Silence Motorcycle Club began, you first have to understand that outlaw motorcycle clubs do not operate randomly. Chapters do not appear by accident, and rivalries do not form because of one bad interaction. Everything moves slowly, through decisions that are made internally, and often long before anyone outside notices a problem. The Hells Angels were founded in California in 1948, and from early on, the club developed a reputation for expansion. What began as a local motorcycle club gradually turned into a network of chapters that stretched across the United States and later into other countries. As the club grew, it developed a consistent way of operating. When a new chapter was established, it was not treated as temporary. It was expected to stay, build influence, and represent the club's interests in that area. Over time, this approach reshaped how other motorcycle clubs reacted to the Hells Angels. In some places, smaller clubs aligned with them. In others, clubs avoided direct contact altogether. What mattered was that the Hells Angels' presence forced decisions. Ignoring them was rarely an option, because doing nothing could be interpreted as allowing influence to slip away. The Sons of Silence formed later, in 1966, in Colorado. Their growth followed a different pattern. Instead of pushing outward rapidly, they focused on establishing themselves firmly in specific regions. Their chapters tended to settle into areas and remain there, building relationships and routines that made their presence feel permanent. Once established, they expected their control of those areas to be respected without constant reinforcement. For many years, the two clubs existed without direct conflict. They were aware of each other, but their territories and interests did not overlap in ways that forced confrontation. That balance began to change as both organizations expanded and as certain regions became more valuable for reasons unrelated to population size or visibility. These areas mattered because of location, access, and the ability to move people, goods, and money through them without interference. When both clubs began operating in the same regions, the situation did not immediately turn violent. At first, the overlap created uncertainty rather than open hostility. Members noticed unfamiliar patches appearing more frequently. Clubhouses and bars that had once felt predictable no longer were. These changes were discussed internally, often without urgency, but they were not ignored. Leadership within each club had to decide how to interpret what they were seeing. Was the other club simply passing through, or were they establishing a long-term presence? Those questions mattered because the answer determined whether a response was necessary. In outlaw motorcycle culture, failing to respond to a perceived challenge can have long-term consequences. It can invite further encroachment and signal a loss of control. At the same time, responding too aggressively carries its own risks. Violence draws attention, both from rivals and from law enforcement. Once that attention is drawn, it becomes difficult to manage. For this reason, early stages of conflict are often marked by restraint rather than aggression. Each side watches the other, waiting to see whether the situation resolves itself or demands action. As time passed and neither club withdrew, the overlap became harder to dismiss. What might have initially been interpreted as coincidence began to look intentional. That shift in perception is critical, because once intent is assumed, neutrality disappears. The situation stops being about coexistence and starts being about control. By the time the first acts of violence occurred, the conflict was already well developed inside both organizations. Decisions had been discussed, weighed, and accepted. Members understood that the situation was no longer temporary, and that whatever followed would likely escalate rather than resolve quickly. From the outside, it would later appear as though the war began suddenly. In reality, it was the result of a long series of decisions, none of which seemed dramatic on their own. The war did not begin with anger or chaos. It began when two clubs reached the same conclusion separately, that the ground they were standing on could not be shared without one of them losing credibility. That realization set everything else in motion. Who actually decides? In late 2018, riders from Hell's Angels began appearing more often along routes that Sons of Silence chapters had treated as routine for years. Not large groups, and not anything dramatic, just enough bikes to be noticed by people who knew what they were looking at. The same patches showed up again and again, in places where they had not been before, and at first nobody reacted. That is normal. One appearance does not mean anything in this world. Even two can be written off. Acting too early creates problems that do not need to exist, and the people who survive long enough to hold influence understand that. What changed was repetition. The same faces began turning up along the same stretches of road. The same bars, the same rest points, spread out over weeks and then months. Nothing hostile happened, but nothing random felt random anymore either. Places that had always felt predictable stopped feeling that way. That kind of shift does not trigger confrontations, but it does trigger conversations. Not loud ones and not emotional ones, just quiet discussions among people who have seen similar situations before and know how quickly they can get out of hand if misread. Those conversations did not happen everywhere at once. They started regionally, then moved upward as patterns became harder to dismiss. People compared notes. Who had seen what, where, and how often? Not rumors, just repetition. When the same details keep coming back, coincidence stops being a convincing explanation. By early 2019, Sons of Silence leadership in certain areas stopped treating the presence as temporary. They did not announce anything or issue warnings, but behavior shifted. Rides stopped lingering in places that suddenly felt shared. Stops were adjusted. Members were told, calmly and without explanation, to be aware of where they were spending time. On the other side, Hell's Angels leadership was watching the same reactions. Movement like that does not happen accidentally, and it does not continue unless someone is paying attention to how it lands. Routes that repeat themselves are chosen. When those routes keep getting used, it is because nobody has been told to stop. That alone says something. Each side believed it was being patient. Each side believed the other was testing limits. Neither side wanted to be the one that backed off first, because backing off without a reason is not neutral in this culture. It becomes part of the story later. As months passed without adjustment from either club, restraint stopped feeling passive and started feeling deliberate. Members sensed it, even if nobody spelt it out. Movements became intentional instead of habitual. People paid more attention to who else was around and where they were standing. Nobody wanted to force a confrontation because that kind of move creates chaos and attracts attention. But nobody wanted to be remembered as the side that did nothing either. That balance became harder to hold the longer the overlap continued. By the time anyone on the ground felt certain that something was coming, the decision had already settled somewhere quieter. Not a dramatic decision and not one spoken out loud, but an understanding that pretending the situation would resolve itself no longer made sense. From that point forward, even small actions carried weight. Because everyone involved knew the overlap was no longer accidental and no longer temporary. Certain roads matter more. Not every place that shows up in a biker conflict looks important from the outside. Some of the places that mattered most in the early stages of this war were easy to overlook. Small towns, highway exits, stretches of road that most people drove through without thinking twice. What made them valuable had nothing to do with how they looked and everything to do with how they connected one place to another. For motorcycle clubs, movement is constant. Chapters are spread out. Members travel for meetings, events, and runs that link one area to the next. Over time, certain routes become familiar, then expected. You know where you stop. You know where you don't. You know which towns are easy to pass through and which ones require more awareness. When those patterns stay consistent, nobody questions them. The problem starts when those patterns change. As both clubs expanded, they didn't just add chapters, they added traffic. More riders moving between states, more bikes passing through the same corridors. The Midwest and Northern Plains mattered in this way because they weren't destinations. They were connectors. Control those connectors, and you don't need to dominate major cities to have influence. You only need to make movement predictable for yourself and uncertain for everyone else. That's why overlap along certain highways and regional routes created tension long before violence followed. When riders from different clubs start using the same roads regularly, they notice each other. When they start stopping in the same places, other people notice too. A bar that sees the same group week after week starts adjusting without being asked. A repair shop does the same. These shifts don't come with announcements, but they don't go unnoticed either. Once a route starts feeling shared, leadership has to decide whether it still belongs to them. That decision is rarely simple. Pulling back can look like conceding ground, especially if the other club stays put. Holding ground means increased exposure, more chances for friction, and more opportunities for things to go wrong. Neither option is clean, and both carry consequences that last longer than the initial choice. Members feel these changes before they're ever discussed openly. A ride that used to feel routine starts feeling deliberate. Stops are shortened. Conversations stay tighter. People pay more attention to who else is around and how long they're staying. None of this feels dramatic in the moment, but it adds up. When riding stops being automatic and starts being calculated, it's a sign that something underneath has shifted. What makes roads and routes so dangerous in these conflicts is that they can't be hidden. You can avoid a clubhouse. You can skip a bar. You can change meeting locations. Roads don't move. If two clubs rely on the same corridors, they will cross paths whether they want to or not. Each crossing creates another opportunity for tension, another moment that can be read the wrong way, another incident that has to be explained internally. As time passed and neither side adjusted its movement, certain areas stopped feeling negotiable. They became lines instead of routes. Once that happens, everything around them tightens. Instructions become more specific. Members are reminded to stay alert, not because something has happened yet, but because something might. By the time leadership on either side accepted that these roads could not be comfortably shared, the conflict had already taken on shape. It was no longer abstract or theoretical. It lived in maps, habits, and daily decisions. Every mile traveled carried more meaning than it used to, and every crossing reinforced the sense that the situation was heading somewhere it could not easily turn back from. Pressure without noise.
It was around 11 a.m. when the engines were roaring and Hells Angels members left the Newmarket area. Riders were headed south on the Don Valley.
Once it was clear that certain routes and stops were no longer accidental points of overlap, the situation shifted into a phase that most people outside this world never notice. Nothing explodes at this stage. There are no public scenes, no dramatic confrontations, and no moments that look like the beginning of a war. Instead, pressure starts getting applied in ways that are easy to deny and hard to ignore. This is the period where both sides are still deciding how far the other is willing to go and whether backing off is even an option anymore. The first signs show up in movement. A group of Hells Angels rides through an area they've been passing through quietly for months, but this time they linger a little longer than usual. Not long enough to cause a scene, but long enough to be noticed by the same people who always notice. On another day, Sons of Silence riders appear in a place they normally wouldn't stop, sit for a short time, then leave without incident. Nobody speaks to anyone they don't know. Nobody makes threats. The message isn't in words, it's in repetition. These appearances start stacking up. A familiar bar sees both patches within the same week. A gas station that used to feel neutral suddenly feels watched. A small adjustment in timing here, a change in route there. Each move is small enough to be dismissed on its own, but together they begin to narrow the space both clubs can operate in without acknowledging the situation directly. For members on the ground, this phase is uncomfortable in a quiet way. You're not told there's a problem, but you're told to be careful. You're not warned about anything specific, but routines change just enough to let you know something is being monitored. You start seeing the same faces more often, and you start recognizing patterns that weren't there before. Nobody talks about it openly, because talking openly forces things to become real. Leadership watches closely during this time, not just for what the other club is doing, but for how their own people react. If members start acting nervous, that's a problem. If they start acting careless, that's a bigger one. Pressure without noise only works if everyone stays disciplined. One wrong move can force escalation before either side is ready. This is also when miscalculations start happening. A presence meant to signal confidence gets read as provocation. A move intended as restraint gets interpreted as avoidance. Because nothing is stated directly, everything becomes interpretation, and interpretation depends on perspective. Once those perspectives drift too far apart, the risk of collision increases fast. Outsiders begin adjusting too, even if they don't understand why. A bar owner starts closing earlier on certain nights. A shop becomes less welcoming without explaining anything. People who have nothing to do with either club sense that something is off and change their behavior accordingly. These small adjustments feed back into the conflict by reinforcing one side's sense of control and the other's sense of being challenged. What makes this stage dangerous is how long it can last. Pressure without noise can stretch on for months, sometimes longer, building tension without releasing it. Every uneventful day adds to the sense that something is being delayed rather than avoided. The longer it continues, the harder it becomes to believe that the situation will resolve itself without someone forcing it to. Eventually, both sides reach the same quiet conclusion. Subtlety has done all it can do. The message has been sent, received, and rejected. Continuing to apply the same kind of pressure stops being strategic and starts being pointless. At that point, the next move has to remove doubt, even if it brings consequences that can't be managed quietly. That's when the nature of the conflict changes. The goal is no longer to signal discomfort or test reactions. That's locally. It's to make the situation unmistakable, not just to the other club, but to everyone watching from the edges. Once that decision settles in, the space for deniability collapses, and the conflict begins to show itself in ways that can't be brushed off or explained away. Silence stops working.
Says the outlaw gangs often battle over drugs and turf.
It's a nasty, dirty, bloody, vomit-covered existence, and there's nothing sexy about it when you're in it.
By mid-2019, silence was no longer buying anyone time. Hell's Angels riders were still moving through the same corridors, still stopping in the same towns, and still doing it without being challenged directly. Sons of Silence chapters in those areas had not pulled back, but they had not pushed forward either. What started as restraint began to feel like drift, and drift is dangerous when both sides are watching closely. The problem wasn't that nothing was happening. The problem was that too much had happened without resolution. The same faces had been seen too often. The same bikes had passed through too many times. At that point, continuing as if it meant nothing started to look intentional. Inside Sons of Silence circles, the question stopped being whether the Hell's Angels' presence was temporary. It became whether it was being tolerated. On the Hell's Angels' side, the read was different, but just as firm. Continued movement without confrontation suggested that the space was open enough to keep using. Not owned outright, but not defended either. In this world, that distinction matters. If ground isn't actively protected, it becomes available. That belief didn't come from arrogance, it came from experience. This is where internal pressure began to build. Members on both sides started noticing that the overlap wasn't going away. Riders talked among themselves about seeing the same patches in places that used to feel predictable. Nobody needed to exaggerate. The repetition spoke for itself. Leadership didn't need to stir anything up. The situation was already doing that on its own. Meetings changed tone again, not because people were angry, but because patience had stopped feeling productive. Silence had been useful early on. It allowed everyone to observe and gather information. Now it felt like avoidance, and avoidance, if it stretches too long, gets remembered later as weakness, whether that was the intention or not. Outside the clubs, the situation began bleeding into daily life. Certain bars in North Dakota and surrounding areas saw tension rise even when nothing overt happened. People noticed when groups stopped overlapping naturally and started avoiding each other with purpose. That kind of avoidance draws attention. Locals might not know why it's happening, but they know when something is off. At this stage, all it takes is one incident to collapse the distance between tension and action. Not a major attack, just something that removes deniability. A confrontation that gets physical instead of ending quietly. Damage that can't be explained away as coincidence. A message that forces the other side to respond publicly. By the time leadership on either side accepted that silence was no longer controlling the situation, the space for subtlety was gone. The conflict had reached a point where continuing to do nothing would cost more than acting. Once that calculation flips, events stop drifting and start accelerating. That was the moment this stopped being a test of patience and became a test of resolve. West Fargo, October 2019.
Nobody was doing anything and they want to start shooting people. They don't leave people alone. I don't know what the problem is.
In late October 2019, the conflict stopped being something you could talk around in North Dakota. On Halloween night in West Fargo, a house fire broke out that police would later confirm was intentional and connected to the rivalry between the Hells Angels and the Sons of Silence. The location mattered. This was not a clubhouse or a biker bar. It was a residential property, and the fire came close enough to spreading that the homeowner had to grab a garden hose and fight it before firefighters arrived. West Fargo police didn't treat the incident as an accident. Investigators publicly stated that the fire was tied to an ongoing feud between the two clubs, and that statement alone changed how the situation was handled from that point forward. Once authorities put both names on the record, the conflict stopped being rumor and started being documented. In the weeks leading up to the fire, officers had already been responding to increased calls involving biker activity in Fargo. There were no public statements and no visible shows of force. Instead, movement tightened. Members avoided predictable routines. Meetings shifted locations. The understanding was clear without being said. A line had been crossed, and leaving it unanswered would invite more of the same. Retaliation followed, but not in one dramatic act. Vehicles connected to members were damaged in separate incidents. Confrontations turned physical faster than before. Law enforcement reports began referencing the rivalry directly when responding to disturbances. Each new incident reinforced the idea that this was no longer a background feud. What made the West Fargo fire different from everything before it was who it endangered. Bringing the conflict into a residential area forced everyone to acknowledge how thin the margin had become. Someone could have died who had nothing to do with either club, and that possibility sat heavy over everything that followed. From that point on, the war didn't escalate because people wanted it to. It escalated because nobody could pretend it wasn't already happening. Mandan, 3rd of July.
This morning, investigators questioning many of the nearly 200 bikers involved in a dramatic shootout that left 9 dead and 18 injured.
On the 3rd of July, 2020, the conflict spilled into the open in Mandan, North Dakota. It happened outside the Silver Dollar Bar on 1st Avenue Northeast, during a street dance that had nothing to do with biker politics on paper. Music, alcohol, a crowd packed tight enough that people assumed nothing serious could happen without someone stepping in. They were wrong. Late that night, a 33-year-old man was surrounded by several others near the edge of the gathering. Witnesses later said it didn't look like an argument that escalated. It looked like something that had already been decided. He was taken to the ground, put into a chokehold, and struck repeatedly. When the stabbing started, it happened fast, and in full view of people who didn't realize what they were watching until it was already over. Police documented 8 stab wounds, including injuries to the head and upper back. The victim survived, but barely. The fact that he lived didn't soften how the incident was treated. Officers on scene quickly realized this wasn't a random fight that got out of hand. Too many people were involved. The movement was coordinated. The speed mattered. Within days, names were attached to the attack. Nash Woolen from Williston, Gerard Lee Glazer from Bismarck, Nicholas Kinsella Greff, and Edward John Knuckles, both from Mandan. All 4 were arrested and later charged with conspiracy to commit murder. Prosecutors also filed criminal street gang charges, a step that immediately framed the attack as part of a larger conflict rather than a one-off act. Investigators connected the incident directly to the ongoing feud between the Hells Angels and the Sons of Silence. Statements collected during the investigation described Sons of Silence members targeting individuals associated with Hells Angels during the street dance. The paperwork didn't hedge. It laid out what law enforcement already believed, that the rivalry had been building for years and had now reached a point where it could no longer be contained to biker spaces. What made Mandan different from earlier incidents was how public it was. This wasn't a fire set at night or a confrontation that ended before police arrived. It was a near-fatal attack in front of witnesses, during a community event, with video, statements, and a trail that prosecutors could follow without relying on rumors. After Mandan, everything tightened. Bars and event organizers across the region started quietly pulling back from hosting anything that might draw members from either side. Police departments treated any gathering with known club presence as a potential flashpoint. Inside the clubs, movement slowed sharply. People stopped showing up where they didn't absolutely need to be. The attack didn't end the war, but it changed its pace. Once conspiracy charges entered the picture, retaliation became harder to justify and harder to hide. Every move now carried the risk of adding years, not just consequences. Mandan wasn't the bloodiest moment of the conflict, but it was the one that proved how little room was left for error. From that night forward, nobody involved could pretend the feud was still manageable. It had crossed into a space where the cost of continuing looked very different than it had before. Everything tightened at once.
Tonight, with motorcycle gangs vowing retaliation, police say their officers have now become targets, so they have stepped up patrol. Officers have also been very critical of the restaurant management here, saying they were warned of the potential violence.
After Mandan, the change wasn't announced, it was felt. Movement across North Dakota and nearby states slowed almost immediately, not because anyone agreed to stop, but because the environment stopped allowing the kind of freedom that had made escalation easy. The violence hadn't burned itself out, it had run into walls. Police presence shifted from general awareness to targeted attention. Patrol units lingered longer near places that had drawn trouble before. Traffic stops became more specific. Officers didn't need explanations anymore. They already knew which patches, bikes, and faces were tied to what they were watching. The margin for mistakes shrank fast, and everyone involved knew it. Bars that had stayed open to both sides quietly stopped taking chances. Some stopped hosting events altogether. Others made it clear, without saying it directly, that certain groups were no longer welcome at the same time. It wasn't ideology, it was risk management. Nobody wanted to be the next Mandan. Once a stabbing happens in the middle of a public event, every owner starts thinking about liability instead of loyalty. Inside the Hells Angels, movement became deliberate to the point of restraint. Chapters didn't disappear, but they stopped pushing presence where it wasn't absolutely necessary. Rides were smaller, stops were shorter, familiar places were avoided if they had started drawing attention. The goal wasn't retreat. It was staying out of the kind of spotlight that turns every incident into a case file. The Sons of Silence adjusted in similar ways. The Mandan arrests hit close enough to home that nobody needed convincing. Once conspiracy charges are on the table, every additional incident risks stacking sentences instead of settling scores. That reality changes behavior faster than any internal rule ever could. What's important is that this slowdown wasn't calm. It was tense. Retaliation didn't vanish, but it became selective and spaced out. People waited longer before acting. Decisions took more discussion. The impulsive edge that had driven earlier confrontations dulled, not because the conflict was resolved, but because the cost had become easier to measure. Outside pressure stayed steady. Investigations didn't close. Names stayed active in reports. Phones that had been seized were still being processed. Cases moved forward even when nothing new happened on the street. That kind of pressure doesn't create peace, but it does narrow options. When options narrow, conflicts lose momentum, whether anyone wants them to or not. By late 2020, the war had entered a holding pattern. Not an end, not a truce, but a pause enforced by consequences rather than agreement. Everyone involved understood that another public incident like Mandan wouldn't just escalate the feud. It would lock it into a legal process that couldn't be walked back. This was how the fighting slowed, not with closure, not with resolution, but with the quiet realization that continuing at the same pace would only make things worse for everyone still standing. What stuck? After the slowdown, attention shifted away from the streets and into courtrooms, not in a dramatic way, but steadily, the way cases move when there is enough evidence to keep them alive. The Mandan stabbing didn't fade into the background. It stayed active in filings, hearings, and quiet updates that mattered more to the people involved than any headline ever could. The 4 men charged after the 3rd of July incident did not disappear from the picture. Nash Woolen, Gerard Lee Glazer, Nicholas Kinsella Greff, and Edward John Knuckles remained tied to the case as it moved forward. Court documents kept the language direct: conspiracy, gang-related activity, intent to cause serious harm. The charges were not reduced to something easier to swallow, and they weren't rushed either. The pace itself became part of the pressure. For the men facing those charges, the war effectively stopped where they stood. Time slowed down into court dates, attorneys, and waiting. Whatever momentum had existed on the street didn't matter anymore. What mattered was what could be proven, what witnesses were willing to say, and what video showed when it was played back frame by frame. That kind of scrutiny strips away bravado quickly. It leaves very little room for mythology. Inside both the Hells Angels and the Sons of Silence, the effect was immediate but unspoken. The arrests and charges didn't end the rivalry, but they rewired how it was remembered. Names attached to court cases don't fade easily. They circulate, they get referenced quietly, they become examples of where escalation actually leads when it goes wrong in the wrong place. The Mandan case also changed how future incidents were handled, even when nothing officially connected them. Anything that looked coordinated now carried extra risk. Anything that happened in public drew instant comparison. People were quicker to walk away, not out of fear, but out of calculation. Once you've seen how fast a street incident can turn into a conspiracy charge, patience starts looking smarter than pride. For law enforcement, the case became an anchor. It gave context to earlier reports and a framework for evaluating anything that followed. When officers encountered members from either side after that, they weren't starting from zero. They already had a reference point, a reminder of how far the conflict had gone and how close it had come to something worse. The rivalry didn't vanish after that. It didn't heal or resolve itself. It hardened into something quieter and more controlled. The violence that followed was rarer, less visible, and far more cautious. The people who stayed active understood that the window for reckless action had closed, at least for the time being. What remained was memory. Of West Fargo, of Mandan, of how fast things moved once they crossed certain lines. That memory became part of how both clubs operated going forward. Not as a lesson spoken aloud, but as a shared understanding of what happens when a feud stops being contained and starts leaving records that can't be burned away. That's how this chapter of the conflict settled. Not with peace, and not with victory, but with consequences that stayed long after the streets went quiet again.
18 wounded.
At last count, we have 170 individuals that we have arrested. Those individuals are being charged with engaging in organized crime.
When the street activity slowed, the conflict didn't disappear. It shifted inward. County jails and state facilities across North Dakota and neighboring states began holding men connected, directly or indirectly, to what had already happened. Some were in on new charges. Others were inside for unrelated reasons. What tied them together was timing. They had all landed there while the feud was still fresh. Inside, names carried weight even when patches were gone. Everyone knew who belonged to the Hells Angels and who ran with the Sons of Silence. That knowledge didn't need to be announced. It showed in where people sat, who they spoke to, and who they avoided. Nothing had to happen for the tension to be understood. It was already there. Contact with the outside didn't stop. Phone calls went out. Attorneys moved between meetings. Family members carried information back and forth, sometimes without realizing how much they were passing along. Bits of news traveled inside faster than paperwork ever could. Who got arrested? Who bonded out? Who didn't? Each update shifted how people saw the situation, even from behind locked doors. For some, being inside froze their role in the conflict. Whatever they had been part of on the outside became fixed. There was no chance to adjust or respond. That kind of pause can harden attitudes fast. Time inside doesn't cool everything down. Sometimes it does the opposite. It gives people room to sit with what happened and decide what it meant to them. At the same time, being locked up limited options. There were no rides, no meetings, no chance encounters. The conflict couldn't be acted on directly. It had to be remembered, talked about carefully, and stored. That storage mattered, because stored conflicts don't fade. They wait. Facilities handled the situation quietly. Separation happened where it needed to. Transfers happened without explanation. Administrators didn't need headlines to understand what they were managing. They'd seen enough to know that proximity creates problems, especially when unfinished business follows people inside. Outside, the war felt paused. Inside, it felt unresolved. Men watched cases develop from a distance. They heard about hearings and delays. They learned who was cooperating and who was staying silent. Those details mattered. Silence inside means something different than silence on the street. It can signal loyalty. It can also signal calculation. Everyone reads it their own way. When some of those men eventually came back out, they didn't return to the same environment they had left. The streets were tighter. Attention was heavier. People moved differently. But the memories came with them. West Fargo didn't disappear. Mandan didn't fade. Those moments stayed sharp because they had never been closed out properly. This is where the conflict settled into something quieter but heavier. Not active enough to explode again right away, but not finished enough to leave behind. The war lived on in waiting rooms, in monitored phone calls, and in people who knew that whatever came next would be shaped by what had already happened. Nothing burned openly during this phase. But nothing cooled either. When leadership got cornered, as time passed, the pressure stopped landing evenly. Some chapters felt it constantly, others only in bursts. But leadership across both clubs began dealing with the same problem from different angles. Decisions that once felt internal were now being shaped by things outside their control. Court calendars, surveillance, informal warnings passed along through attorneys and intermediaries. The room to maneuver kept shrinking. Inside the Hells Angels, chapter heads started weighing every move against consequences that had nothing to do with reputation. Showing strength still mattered, but strength that attracted attention carried a cost that could not be shared evenly. One bad call could put an entire chapter under scrutiny for months. That reality didn't weaken authority, it boxed it in. The Sons of Silence faced the same squeeze. Some chapters had already taken hits through arrests and court cases tied to Mandan and earlier incidents. Others were watching closely, knowing that staying quiet didn't guarantee safety, but acting openly almost guaranteed problems. Leadership conversations narrowed to timing and containment, not how to win, but how to avoid losing more than had already been lost. This pressure showed up in subtle ways. Requests took longer to answer. Meetings ended without clear direction. Instructions came down phrased carefully, leaving room for interpretation rather than demanding action. That ambiguity wasn't confusion. It was caution. And caution in this world is often mistaken for weakness by people who don't carry the responsibility of consequences. Members noticed. They didn't challenge it openly, but they felt the shift. Leaders who once moved decisively now paused more often. That pause created its own strain because loyalty depends on confidence. When confidence has to be measured against legal exposure, it changes tone. The patch doesn't feel lighter, but it starts pulling in different directions. What made this moment especially difficult was that there was no clean exit. Stepping back entirely would look like surrender. Pushing forward risked pulling federal attention into places it hadn't reached yet. Holding steady meant absorbing pressure without relief. Every option came with trade-offs, and none of them promised closure. Outside observers sometimes mistake this phase for decline. It isn't. It's compression. Authority doesn't disappear. It tightens. Decisions get made by fewer people, shared with fewer voices, and carried out more carefully. That kind of control can hold for a long time, but it requires patience that not everyone has. By this point, the war had changed shape again. It wasn't driven by anger or momentum. It was driven by constraint. Leadership wasn't trying to escalate or end things outright. They were trying to keep the situation from tipping into something that couldn't be managed at all. That cornering effect didn't bring peace. It brought restraint, and restraint held only as long as nothing else pushed too hard. Federal eyes don't blink. By the time the year rolled forward, the attention stopped feeling local. Traffic stops and patrol cars were one thing. What followed felt different. Files started moving between offices. Phone records that had sat untouched were pulled back out. Names that had only mattered inside a few counties began appearing in conversations that stretched across state lines. Agents didn't announce themselves all at once. People noticed the change when questions started coming from outside jurisdictions, when stops turned into interviews, when warrants referenced incidents months apart as if they were part of the same thread. That's when it became clear this was no longer being treated as a string of bad nights. It was being treated as a pattern. Members connected to the Hells Angels and the Sons of Silence felt it differently depending on where they stood. Some were contacted directly. Others heard about it through lawyers who suddenly had more questions than answers. Phones went quiet. Messages got shorter. People stopped speculating because speculation travels. The pressure didn't come with raids or headlines. It came with patience. Investigators waited. They watched. They connected incidents that had once felt isolated. West Fargo sat next to Mandan in the same conversations now. So did smaller confrontations that never made the news. The timeline mattered more than any single act. What changed fastest was behavior around communication. People stopped saying certain things altogether. Meetings shifted again, not because anyone expected something immediate, but because nobody wanted to be the weak link in a larger picture they could no longer see fully. The war had gained an audience that didn't respond to intimidation or reputation. It responded to records. Businesses felt the shift as well. Places that had survived the earlier phases by staying quiet realized that quiet no longer protected them. Being associated with either side, even indirectly, started to feel like an unnecessary risk. Doors closed earlier. Events disappeared from calendars. Familiar spots went dark without explanation. This didn't end anything, it narrowed it. Every move now carried the possibility of becoming evidence later. That awareness doesn't stop conflict on its own, but it changes how it's expressed. Acts that once would have happened openly were reconsidered. Timing mattered more. Location mattered more. Witnesses mattered most of all. For some, this was the first time the cost felt permanent. Fires can be repaired. Fights can be forgotten. Federal cases don't fade the same way. They stretch. They resurface. They pull in people who thought they were done with whatever they had been part of. By this stage, the war was no longer driven by momentum. It was being shaped by gravity. Everything slowed because everything weighed more, and once that weight settled in, nobody involved expected things to return to how they had been before, no matter how quiet the streets became. Quiet hits, no crowds. The violence didn't stop after Mandan. It changed how it showed up. In early 2021, a pickup truck linked to a member of the Sons of Silence was found torched outside Dickinson, North Dakota. It wasn't parked at a bar or near a clubhouse. It was left overnight in a residential area far enough from anything public that the fire could burn without interruption. By the time firefighters arrived, the cab was gone and the engine block was cracked. No witnesses came forward. No one claimed to have heard anything unusual. A few weeks later, near Minot, a garage used by associates of the Hells Angels was broken into after midnight. Tools were taken. 2 motorcycles were damaged badly enough that they couldn't be ridden. No attempt was made to steal them. Whoever did it knew exactly what they were there to destroy. The door was forced quietly, not smashed. The neighbors slept through it. These weren't accidents, and they weren't random. They were deliberate and restrained. No crowds, no confrontation, no statements made afterward. Each incident stood alone on paper, but people involved didn't read them that way. They recognized the pattern because they'd lived the earlier version of it. What mattered was what didn't happen next. There was no immediate response, no visible gathering, no public show of force. The absence of reaction was intentional. Anything loud would have drawn attention back to places everyone was trying to keep off the map. Instead, people waited. Waiting became the response. Similar incidents followed through the year: vandalism that targeted vehicles instead of people, threats delivered through damage rather than words, properties checked but not entered, lines crossed just far enough to be understood without forcing a reply that couldn't be contained. Law enforcement logged each event, but none of them were dramatic enough on their own to justify major action. That was the point. Each incident created pressure without creating a scene. Whoever was responsible understood the environment they were operating in and adjusted accordingly. For members on both sides, this phase felt different from earlier violence. It was colder, more personal. There was no adrenaline rush, no crowd to feed off, just the quiet knowledge that someone had been close enough to touch what mattered and chose when to walk away. This was how the conflict stayed alive without reigniting openly. Damage replaced confrontation. Timing replaced speed. Silence replaced noise. The war hadn't ended. It had learned how to breathe slowly, and for the people caught in it, that was almost worse. The parts nobody got back. The slowdown didn't bring relief to the people who had already been dragged through it. For them, the damage didn't pause just because the violence went quiet. It showed up later, in pieces, and usually alone. In Fargo, a small auto shop that had quietly serviced bikes for years shut its doors without notice in mid-2021. The owner didn't make a statement. He didn't need to. After police questioned him twice about people who no longer showed up, customers stopped coming. Insurance rates jumped. Suppliers hesitated. One morning, the lights just didn't come back on. The building sat empty for months before anyone touched it again. Families felt it in ways that never made reports. Kids stopped asking why their fathers were gone so often and started asking when they were coming back. Phones rang less. Holidays passed with chairs left empty without explanation. Some people moved. Not dramatically, just quietly packing up and leaving towns where their last name had started carrying weight they didn't ask for. Members who weren't charged still paid. Jobs disappeared after background checks pulled up old associations. Leases weren't renewed. Banks asked questions that didn't used to come up. Nothing about it felt coordinated, but it didn't need to be. Once a reputation settles into a place, it does its own work. In Mandan, organizers cancelled the street dance the following year. No press release, no announcement. It simply wasn't scheduled. People noticed when July rolled around and nothing was set up. The silence said enough. Nobody wanted to be remembered as the place where things went wrong. Some men tried to step back from everything without making it obvious. They rode less, showed up late, kept their distance without explaining why. That kind of withdrawal doesn't go unnoticed, but neither does forcing someone to stay when the pressure has already done its work. People were tired in a way that didn't fix itself. The war didn't leave behind a clear line where things broke. It scattered the damage. One business at a time, one family at a time, one town deciding it had seen enough. That kind of cost doesn't feel dramatic, but it lasts longer because it doesn't announce itself. By this point, nobody involved could pretend the conflict had only affected those who chose to be part of it. Too many others had absorbed the fallout without ever standing in the middle of it. The streets were quieter, but the absence of noise didn't mean things were better. It just meant the bill had come due, and it wasn't being paid all at once. What people lost during this phase wasn't territory or status, it was normalcy. And that's the one thing this kind of conflict never gives back once it's gone. What never really ends. By the time the calendar moved forward again, there was no moment anyone could point to and say it was over. No handshake, no announcement, just a gradual thinning of activity that felt more like people stepping around something dangerous than walking away from it. In Bismarck, a rider tied loosely to the Hells Angels sold his bike and left town in late 2021. He didn't patch out, he didn't explain himself, he just stopped showing up, and after a while people stopped asking. That kind of exit doesn't make noise, but it gets noticed. Others followed in smaller ways. Fewer rides, less visibility, a habit of choosing distance when proximity used to be automatic. On the other side, a Sons of Silence member who had been present during earlier tensions took a job out of state and stayed there. No ceremony, no fallout. He kept contact limited and avoided places that used to feel familiar. People understood without saying it. Not everyone wants to keep living inside something that already took more than it gave. Still, the rivalry didn't disappear. It settled into memory. Stories about West Fargo and Mandan didn't get retold often, but when they did, they were short and specific. No exaggeration. Just reminders of how fast things had moved and how little room there had been to fix it once they did. Those memories carried weight because they were tied to real outcomes, not legend. Occasionally, someone tested the edges. A look held too long. A presence noted where it hadn't been expected. Nothing exploded, but nothing reset either. The understanding remained that certain lines still existed, even if nobody was eager to cross them again. What lasted longest was the awareness. Towns remembered, law enforcement remembered, businesses remembered. So did the people who had watched everything unfold without choosing a side and paid for it anyway. That kind of memory doesn't fade on a schedule. It lingers and shapes behavior long after the events themselves stop happening. This is how wars like this actually end, if end is even the right word. Not with closure, but with fatigue. Not with peace, but with caution. The conflict didn't resolve itself. It learned its limits. And those limits are fragile. They hold only as long as everyone involved remembers why pushing past them once had cost so much. What happened between the Hells Angels and the Sons of Silence wasn't a legend or a rumor. It was real damage, real fear, and real consequences that didn't fade when the noise stopped. The streets went quiet, but the cost stayed behind.